CBS News has learned President Trump has told close confidants that the United States would likely withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. President Trump is also considering an attempt to renegotiate the agreement's protocols on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The president tweeted out Wednesday morning, "I will be announcing my decision on the Paris Accord over the next few days." Rob Meyer, an associate editor at The Atlantic who writes about climate change, is in our Washington bureau. So, Rob, 195 countries signed on to the Paris Agreement. What would it mean for U.S. diplomatic relationships if the president decides to drop out?
Well, it would be a pretty big deal. When President Obama and the State Department secured the agreement in 2015, one of the things that many countries talked about was how important getting the U.S. participation in the whole treaty process was. I think that when the U.S. pulls out of this agreement, it will not be the first that the U.S. has negotiated during the Obama administration, and then pulled out during the Trump administration. We saw that with the TPP. But I think it'll be a sign that the U.S. is, under President Trump at least, not really stepping up to the same kind of global diplomatic mantle that President Obama aspired to, and that has been a very traditional U.S. role in the world since the close of World War II.
Well, how exactly would the exit process work, and what would the timeline be?
Yeah, so there's like two different processes, then we don't know which one the Trump administration will choose yet. There's one that takes 3 years, and that one is if the U.S. just pulls out of the Paris Agreement by itself. All President Trump would have to do is sign a piece of paper, and it would start a 3-year process, and then at the end of that time in 2019, the U.S. would no longer be a party to the Paris Agreement. But the downside of that approach, at least from the Trump administration perspective, is that a future president in 2020 or 2025 could rejoin the treaty. There would be nothing stopping them from just joining on. There's a shorter time frame that the administration could opt for, which is if the U.S. left an underlying treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, then it would only take 1 year. The problem is that the UN Framework Convention was adopted in 1992 by George H.W. Bush, and it's kind of an important part of his legacy, and a lot of Republicans in the Senate don't want to leave it. So there's two different time frames here. One of them would take longer and be easier, but one of them would be shorter, and I think a lot of Republicans might oppose it, even if they don't like the Paris Treaty.
Well, as you know, major oil companies, including Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP, have all supported the Paris Climate Agreement. Why are they on board, and why isn't President Trump?
It's an interesting question. I think because a lot of those oil companies, including Peabody Coal, which is the largest coal company in the country, didn't speak up when President Trump was rescinding any of the other climate policies that really add teeth to the promises that President Obama made under the Paris Agreement. I think many of them support the Paris Agreement because it's actually pretty friendly to U.S. and fossil fuel interests. The commitments that it makes are non-binding, they're very voluntary. There's nothing stopping the Trump administration from staying in Paris and issuing just a less ambitious proposal to reduce greenhouse gases than the one that the Obama administration put forward. I think also many of those oil companies have realized that support for climate change action is pretty wide among younger people, including among Republicans younger than 30. And so they see being active on climate change and looking like they're making some progress on climate change as good for their business and good for their brand.
So why isn't the president behind the Paris Agreement?
That's an interesting question. I don't think there has been an argument that from the president that has been fully that hasn't been rebuffed in some way by its supporters. The president has always opposed the Paris Agreement. He opposed it from his first energy policy speech in May 2016. He thinks it's a bad deal for the United States, that the United States will reduce will hurt U.S. fossil fuel interests and U.S. workers. And it won't hurt other countries in the world in the same way. And you hear him repeat a line a lot that it will hurt the U.S. and support China and India's growing economies, which I think there's a lot of discussion about whether that's true. But unlike previous climate agreements like the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, all countries, including the U.S., China, India, Germany, the UK, have all made proposals to reduce their carbon emissions. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which left out China and India.
Well, you alluded to this a moment ago, but a Yale survey found about half of Trump voters think the U.S. should stay in that kind of climate agreement. What does that signal to you?
I think it signals to me that there is a lot of support in the U.S., first of all, for the status quo. People tend to oppose climate policies until they become law, and then they support them. The same is true, by the way, of Obama's Clean Power Plan, which is the electricity sector climate change policy. Most Republicans support that as well, and most Americans support that. I think it also signals that to most people, to most Americans, climate change is not an issue that they are super worried about. That they want something to be done about it, but they're not overly concerned about it. And so while they support the party leaders who they may identify with as they pursue one climate policy or another, they're not going to go out of their way to kind of tear up something that the last party did, or they don't want to see really aggressive action there. That they just want something to be done, and they kind of trust their leaders to do it.
All right, Rob Meyer from The Atlantic, thanks very much.
Hey, thank you for having me.